This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living Catholic, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother and of Sacred Heart Parish in Oklahoma City. The news recently arrived that the Office of Saints in Rome was proclaiming Carlo Acutis to be canonized. The date has not yet been set for the canonization ceremony, but it will be soon, and we can look forward to the splendor and the ceremony of this newest saint. It will no doubt be broadcast all over Catholic media, and we'll be reminded as part of the reporting that there hasn't been anything like this in quite a while. Carlos has made the big time. He was born in London in 1991. His parents were not particularly religious, although he was baptized as a child. When Carlos made his first communion, his mother returned to the practice of the faith. It took a long time for his father to undertake the same journey. Carlos, it seemed, took to the faith early. He attended a number of schools as his parents moved around, eventually ending up in a school in northern Italy, sponsored by a religious order. As a child, he was enthusiastic about receiving First Communion, and as he grew up, his attention and devotion to the Eucharist deepened. He even put together a presentation about Eucharistic miracles that have occurred throughout the ages, this apparently being a kind of window onto his piety. Carlos was a creature of his time. He was interested in computers and computer games, and more than being a passive receiver, he also learned to program and to code, taking to the digital age as a true enthusiast. According to a brief biography of him I saw, he's said to have been good at using Dreamweaver and Java and Ubuntu, which I just barely recognize as computer programs, but like a lot of young guys who get interested in the digital, he seemed also to be especially good at helping others who had computer problems. Websites and web designs was one of his specialties. It'd be a mistake, however, to imagine he spent all of his time in front of the keyboard and on the screen. Soccer was also one of his passions, as was being a fan of several of the teams around his hometown. He wasn't that good in school, it seems, but he did teach himself the saxophone, and he liked to go out on the boat that his family kept at a nearby lake. In sum, it seemed like he was a pretty normal kid. Perhaps not so normally, at age 12, he became a catechist in his parish at his pastor's request. He'd teach his peers and those younger the basics of the faith in order to supplement the instructions given by the older teachers. It was in these classes that the rest of the world came to know of his deep faith and his commitment to the Eucharist and to Eucharistic piety. And unlike a lot of kids his age, he had a list of saints that he admired, including St. Francis, St. Tarcisius, and Maria Magdalena de Pazzi. No doubt about it, he was pious at a time when kids generally aren't. But he was also an only child in a privileged family. If anyone could be different, according to his private interests, he certainly could. It's important to note that he was different. It's also important to note that in his difference from other kids, he was also pious. On October the 1st, 2006, when he was 15, he came down with a severe sore throat, which doesn't sound very threatening, but as his condition continued to worsen, he was diagnosed with having acute leukemia, and very quickly, as the sickness worsened, was given little chance at recovery. He fell into a coma and was pronounced brain dead on October the 11th. He died on October the 12th, 2006. That's just 11 days after he first fell sick. Noted for his piety and his passion, his death didn't end his influence, because from the time of his passing, more and more people noted the growing interest in his life and the spiritual example that he had exuded. More and more people turned to him to ask his intercession in prayer. Numerous miracles were recorded, leading up to his proclamation as blessed, and now up to canonization. The most notable of the claims for miraculous intercession was that his mother gave birth to twins at age 44, exactly 4 years to the day after his death. While it's not regarded officially as an act of supernatural intervention, it is a hint of the impact that his life and example had on those who knew him. In all of this, he's regarded as a saint for our age. And indeed he is. Every saint is an example of the age in which his sanctity is lived. Carlos, no less than Augustine or Ignatius or Maximilian Kolbe or any of the other great saints in the Church. The word canonization comes from the word canon, which simply means a list. To canonize someone or something is just to put the name on the list. You can speak of the canon of the great Beatles songs, or the canon of the Book of Scriptures, or the long list of those names of people who have become saints. By the decree of the Vatican, Carlos Acutis has now been added to this list. He has become a character of our time, an example for all of us and to all of us. And what could be more engaging than a young man who's moved by all of the passions of our day? Computer games and soccer, websites and saxophones. What would more embody a kid of our day and age than that? That he encountered a life in Christ and desired to serve him set him apart from so many of his compatriots and classmates. But this encounter was real, and his desire to serve was authentic. Now that we have the authenticated results of his intercession and the miracles that have resulted, we know his desire to be with Christ and to embody the presence of Christ was real. He is a saint for young people, a saint for the 2000s, a saint for all of those who wish to bring the encounter with Christ alive in their own lives. Every example of those who follow Christ is valuable. Each person who encounters Christ and listens to his invitation to follow me is a witness to the possibility of making Christ alive in our own hearts. And this is as true from the example of our grandmothers and our pious uncles as it is for the notable saints and those who've been added to the list and who are canonized, those saints whose holy cards we collected when we were kids. While we don't put those names, the names of our grandmothers and our parents on the list and their examples, and the fact that we know them make the possibility of life in Christ something to emulate. They are living examples, portraits of Jesus' invitation. And as I look back on my life, there are several examples of witnesses to choose from. The premier ones were my father and mother. Both of them were pious and dutiful. This didn't really set them apart all that much from their generation, all of whom went to Mass on Sundays and prayed regularly. But I didn't know these others in the same way I knew my parents. They performed the faith for me day in and day out. And from them I learned what being a Catholic is supposed to be because I watched them live out the faith. Now, they weren't perfect, neither in their decisions nor in their piety. My father could be short and irritable. My mother could be critical and exasperated, not to mention sarcastic and dismissive. But their belief never implied perfection, and it certainly didn't presume that they hid their faults from anyone, especially themselves. While they were not saints, they were the real human examples of true faith and passionate belief that I grew up with and learned from. When I think of what the heart of my faith is, I don't think of the Vatican dome that towering over St. Peter's Square. Neither do I think of the Catholic Catechism on my shelf or of the 3 volumes of the Sacramentum Mundi. What I think about is my father and mother praying the rosary as we huddled in the cellar during the withering blows of the wild spring thunderstorms when I was a child. As the wind lashed the tin on the door and the hail beat across the yard, they Hail Married and Holy Married back and forth in the lantern light. And they prayed that way, not because they were pious, as if they were performing only to be seen and noted. They prayed that way because they turned to God and trusted in divine protection as the only protection they could trust in. They believed and they prayed. That was their witness to me. Besides that, I remember one day in which my uncle talked about the content of the faith in his life. In the family I grew up in, mostly they addressed the foundations of life by indirection and allusion. Seldom did anyone talk about belief or decision, much less conversion and change when it came to the faith. Once, as we were gassing up our tractors to go out to the field for plowing, my uncle mentioned something he'd seen in the newspaper that was critical of the faith. You boys, he said, have to pay attention to what people say about those things because they expect you to believe them, referring to the criticism he read. An old guy like me, he said, I just tell them where they were wrong and then just go on. There's nothing they could do about me. Now, What he said is not exactly parallel to St. Thomas More's admission that he was the king's good servant, but God's first. But what my uncle had to say was an insight into his life and character. And while it wasn't particularly moving, I never forgot it. And what I never forgot is that if you wanted to be a real man, a real adult, you were firm and solid in the faith. That's what I learned from him. He and my father and mother were people of their age. All witnesses of the faith can only be witnesses of their own age. Carlos Acutis is a witness of the life of faith in this cyber age in which the life of the soul seems less important than a life online. And the serious challenge of the faith seems to have more to do with making time in a busy schedule than it does with finding a remedy for your lost soul. He performed the faith in a way someone of our time might notice and emulate, or at least admire. The most important aspect of his life is the most obvious, which is that he lived it. His life was his own. Carlos was able to chart his own way as he responded to the presence of Christ in his heart. In every age, the saint is the one who provides a new insight into what following Christ might be, because no one had yet quelled the path that this saint had walked. No one has had the chance to be the saint Carlos became as he became it. And because he did become a saint, his sanctity becomes a model, an example of the promise that anyone can become a saint in his or her own age. The cruel indifference of our age to the life of faith and the stunning ignorance of even the merest outline of what our ancestors lived and practiced, these are not barriers to real faith. This saint, St. Carlos, was able to put these aspects of his life off to the side and live for Christ in a way that transformed himself. Saints make their world different by making their world the natural place for belief and practice. Every saint does this. Carlos performed his faith among the upper-class world of northern Italy and transformed the scenery of his life into the decoration of true holiness. Now, what this means for a kid in Oklahoma who discovers this example is, of course, open to question. Finding out someone like him made a commitment to Christ could be just the invitation that this kid needs to see himself as given to Christ as well. If this young person could do it and his life was filled with blessing and promise, then such a thing could happen for that kid too, he might think. After all, our lives are in fact measured in heroes. If this person of heroic virtue and notable impact lived such a life here and now, then my life might count for something more than merely getting through the day. It's how most examples of holiness are founded. When St. Ignatius of Loyola was trapped in bed, recovering from surgery on his leg, he read stories of the great saints. At the end of the day, when he wanted to imitate their greatness, he duplicated their example, and he asked himself, why couldn't I do such things? He asked himself. The ultimate question he came to was, why not? This could be the same response from someone in South Oklahoma City reading the life of Blessed Carlos. Why not indeed? Of course, there's no guarantee. A young man could read Carlos's story and decide there's nothing in it for him. He could find out that Carlos was an only child of accomplished parents who could flit from London to Berlin to Milan, and then decide that there's no way such a life as that is like his life. Or that kid could decide that anyone who had a personal nanny to help him when he was growing up is just not like anyone he could imitate. So he gives up. That's all true. There's never been any life that's completely duplicable, since there are no lives identical to one another. A young man growing up in Oklahoma City or Elk City could see the example of maybe St. Augustine or St. Vincent de Paul to be something more inspirational and more applicable than the story of a kid who died of leukemia on a respirator in northern Italy 10 years ago. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes. There's no one size fits all. We take inspiration from those who give it to us. A few years ago, for example, a young soldier wrote a book detailing his desire to enter West Point and to be commissioned an officer. This was after 9/11, and he was on fire to serve his country in a way that mattered to him and to the people that he wanted to protect. Not only was he interested in being on the front lines to defend his family, but he was entranced by the example of the life of Dwight Eisenhower. Ike had gone to West Point just because it was a way to go to college. He didn't burn with zeal or patriotism, but with a desire for a decent education and a way up from this hardscrabble life. He, in the small town where he was raised, he could escape from all that. But Eisenhower also thought that the uniform from West Point would turn the heads of the girls in town, especially the daughter of the town banker who had never once looked at him in high school. But all these things being true, once in the service, this future hero's life took a turn toward greatness, and he never looked back as they brought him to the apex of military and national success. This young soldier didn't want to model his life on Eisenhower's. That'd be impossible. After all, it's the beginning of the 21st century, not the end of the 19th. But he wanted his life to turn toward the possibilities that had shaped Eisenhower's life. It was not to duplicate his life, but to be formed by the same opportunities and molded by the same example. That's what heroes do. They shape the imagination and allow us to dream of a way forward from this life now. Saints invite us to heroism. Carlo Acutis' example is for the heroic child who can open doors to the imaginative life of a young man or a young woman who's looking for meaning and purpose guided by God. St. Augustine is the hero for someone who struggles to find an answer amid all of the fervid opinions of a manic culture. St. Ignatius is the hero he's the hero who knows he has to overcome his own silly ideals and vanities in order to become a true servant of what is good and holy. And St. Gertrude Stein is the heroic example of a woman moved by the power of intellect to guide her heart and to order her affections in a world that does not appreciate either. And on and on. There are heroes everywhere in the life of the faith. We've only to look and to see. They're there to guide us no matter where we begin or where we'd like to end up. But of course, there are those who are not so enthusiastic about St. Carlo Acutis. It's safe to say that grumpy voices are everywhere, and no one is 100% about anything in the church, including the choice the Vatican makes about saints. A person could be excused for thinking that if there's one thing the Vatican could do without controversy, it would be naming saints. But that just isn't so. Not everyone who heard the news about the canonization was overjoyed by adding his name to the list. The criticism broke down into two major categories. Firstly, you might call it the conservative category, although that's more of a placeholder than an accurate meaning. But it's this. Their complaint is that Carlos is a lightweight. Making a big deal about a kid who loved Jesus, appreciating the computer, and was good at computers, is something like giving a participation trophy to all the kids on the softball team. It's to make a big deal out of what every Catholic ought to be doing. Anyone who receives First Communion should also want to grow closer to Christ. It is supposed to happen to everyone, not just that way. The criticism broke down, and it eventually came to rely on the fact that it just didn't seem to describe a kid very well. Rewarding somebody who's actually received First Communion to grow closer to Christ is setting the standards of sanctity way too low, they say. Extraordinary virtue in the minds of these critics just isn't what it used to be. How about some African youngster who deals with the threat of death from a hostile tribe across the river who doesn't share the same faith? Now, he could be an example of true bravery in a world of soft Christianity. A cute kid who toots the saxophone is no great saint, or at least not one for a bold young man to aspire to, they say. Shouldn't it all be something more splendid? And certainly St. Carlos would be no Tarcisius, who was beaten to death by a mob for carrying the Eucharist to condemned prisoners. And he's no Maria Goretti, whose brave defense of her virginity cost her her life. Carlos's example of Eucharistic devotion and catechetical faithfulness is a pale comparison to those martyrs. But Carlos didn't live in 3rd century Rome or 19th century Ancona. He lived in a suburb of Milano in 21st century Italy. No mobs were raging in his life, except perhaps after a bad soccer loss, and no one was pressing to violate his integrity except inviting him to press a computer button to look at porn. His life, as it was, is the point. He's a saint precisely by being the faithful servant of Christ in his world, just as these other child saints were servants of Christ in their world. He's a faithful example of joyful Christianity precisely because of the slack, faithless, obsessive, sick, silly society that he was a part of. And because he is that example, he is our saint today. The other complaint might be described as the liberal side of the issue because it's pointed to the unexplored and to the unrealized. And it's this: child saints are just too unworldly to be a decent example. Carlos's life is not an example for our world, not the outline of hope for a young man or a young woman in our day and time, because he's young. It's fine to describe all the piety and devotion of a young man because we all know young men can be so serious and so focused on what captures their interest. But the great divide of growing up had yet to be crossed. Carlos had not wrestled much with the hot-blooded passions lying in wait later in life. And because he didn't, we shouldn't honor his example with such attention. A boy might see in Carlos the journey of a hero, turn his life to be more like Carlos's life, and then find out that he can't navigate the turbid waters of his growing up with the same detachment and purity that Carlos did. When those waters begin to rock the faith of that young man, he might find that there's not enough stability in what he knows to keep himself afloat. For the critic, Carlos is just too young to matter. But that sounds too much like the chant of the old man, morbid and angry at the youth of those around him. This follows on a strain of thought I've seen about religious concerns for the last many years, and it goes something like this. For example, if someone asks, "Can you explain what a sacrament is?" the person responds by saying, "Well, it's complicated and intricate, and it presumes you know enough history and theology and psychology and spirituality so as to make sense of the explanation, and that you'll never understand even the beginning of anything anyone could say about it. So it's better that I not explain it to you, that is, until you learn all these other things. And when you do, then you'll be able to figure it out." So the answer to the question, "Can you tell me what a sacrament is?" becomes, "No, I can't and I won't." Now, that may sound like an exaggeration, but it's not really. I've heard just that kind of thing before. Criticizing Carlos because he didn't experience the faith as a mature Christian, long advanced on his journey, is to criticize him because he wasn't someone other than Carlos. It's not a credible critique. The greatness of his holiness is because it is he who embodies it and no one else. We, at the Blessed Stanley Rother Shrine, celebrate the greatness of the example of Stanley Rother. His bravery and steadfast example inspire all of us, even though we're not missionaries in Central America, nor will we become them. But his holiness gives us a reason to desire holiness. Father Rother is a man of his time and a blessed man of his place. It's the same for Saint Carlos Acutis. His greatness lies amidst his life, and it's where we will find his holiness. We can desire the sanctity he lived. He's a saint for his time so that we might be saintly in our time. Back in just a moment. Welcome to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called He Said, He Said. The important parts of living speech are not what's said. Pauses and elisions, they are how meaning is fed. Amid every conversation between one and another, meaning bounces, tapping one, then the other. For words, no matter their overwhelming power, are not sufficient, will not top Babel's power, are left only half of potential speech. Rely on the in-between to accomplish their reach. Thus, when he and he, in that moment in between, when words are not yet formed, lie unripened and green, secret power is at work, thickly accumulating, all meaning pressing and concentrating, compounded and assembled, it pours forth, and the compass needle, trembling, points north. Do not hurry then what should be said or not. Raw ore is refined only when it first gets hot. That's he said, he said. I hope you join us in the weeks to come here at Living Catholic.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.